This album right here, I understand, was the biggest advance seller at the recent.
Really? No, it is. It's got AUM. What's the name of that? Living in the Sunlight, Living in the Moonlight. Is that an original? When Tiny Tim collapsed on The Tonight Show, Johnny Carson thought it was just another stunt, but something sinister was happening behind the scenes. From his 6 showers a day to his secret request for an open marriage, Tiny Tim's bizarre behavior had finally become too much. Now, decades later, we're uncovering why television's favorite oddball was quietly shown the door, and the shocking reason he was never invited back. Tiny Tim was born Herbert Buckingham Cowrie on April 12, 1932, in New York City. His parents came from very different backgrounds. His father, Boutros Cowrie, was a Lebanese Maronite Catholic who worked in a textile factory. His mother, Tilly Staff, was a Polish Jewish garment worker and the daughter of a rabbi. Their home in Washington Heights was filled with different traditions, but Herbert never felt like he fit in. He was a shy and awkward child, lost in his own world. While other kids played outside, he spent hours alone, listening to music from an era long before his time. His obsession began when he was 5 years old. His father brought home a wind-up gramophone and a 78 RPM record of Beautiful Ohio by Henry Burr. The sound of that old recording did something to him. It was as if he had discovered a secret world hidden in the past. From that moment on, nothing else mattered. He spent hours at the New York Public Library searching for sheet music and records from the 1890s to the 1930s. He copied rare songs by hand, determined to learn them all. While most kids his age were following the latest trends, Herbert was digging deeper into the past, becoming a living archive of forgotten music. School was another story. He attended George Washington High School, but struggled so badly that he repeated his sophomore year twice. Eventually, he dropped out. His parents worried about his future, but he didn't seem to care. He had already found his true passion. Without any formal training, he taught himself to play the guitar and ukulele. He practiced for hours, studying old recordings and mimicking the styles of early performers. He was drawn to artists like Arthur Godfrey and Rudy Vallee. One day, he discovered something unusual. He could sing in a high, trembling falsetto. At first, it was just an experiment, but soon he realized that this voice was something special. It made him different, and he liked that. By the 1950s, he had fully embraced his uniqueness. He grew his hair long, something almost unheard of for men at the time. He covered his face in white makeup, calling it a symbol of purity. He wanted to look like an old silent film star, a figure from a lost time. His mother was horrified. She thought her son was losing his mind, even considered sending him to Bellevue Hospital for psychiatric treatment. His father stepped in and convinced her to let him be. Maybe Herbert was strange, but he wasn't crazy. He was just following a path no one else could see. Tiny Tim's rise to fame was as unusual as the man himself. He performed under names like Larry Love, Texarkana Teeks, and Judas K. Foxglove, hoping one of them would stick. His first real gigs were at Hubert's Museum in a live flea circus in Times Square. It was a place for the unusual sword swallowers, fire breathers. Tiny Tim fit right in. By the early 1960s, he had found a home in Greenwich Village. He played at small clubs like Page 3, performing 6 hours a night for just $96 a month. His act was unlike anything people had seen before. He sang forgotten Tin Pan Alley songs in a high falsetto. He strummed his ukulele with delicate precision. His performances felt like a strange mix of comedy and nostalgia. But it wasn't just his music that stood out. He grew his hair long. He painted his face pale. He wore clothes inspired by silent film stars. Some people saw him as a joke. Others saw something special. In 1963, his manager George King gave him a new name, Tiny Tim. It was meant to be ironic. He was 6 feet 1 inch, towering over most people. But the name came from the frail little boy in A Christmas Carol. Somehow it suited him perfectly. By the mid-1960s, he had built a loyal following. People whispered about him in underground music circles. He was still a mystery to most, but that was about to change. On January 22, 1968, Tiny Tim stepped onto the set of Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In. The show thrived on fast-paced humor and unexpected guests, but no one was ready for what they saw. He walked on stage carrying a shopping bag, pulled out his ukulele, and started to sing. His first song was A Tisket, A Tasket. Then he followed it with On the Good Ship Lollipop. The audience was stunned. His high-pitched voice, his long hair, his strange old-fashioned suit. He looked like a lost character from another era. People couldn't decide what to think. Some laughed, believing he was a comedy act. Others were fascinated by his sincerity. He returned to the show twice more that year, performing a song that would define him forever, Tiptoe Through the Tulips. His eerie falsetto voice carried through television screens across America. It was strange. It was unforgettable. Overnight, Tiny Tim became a sensation. Dan Rowan, one of the show's hosts, later said that Tiny Tim was exactly the kind of act they wanted. He was bizarre. He was unexpected. He was impossible to ignore. By the end of 1968, Tiny Tim was no longer just a cult figure. He was famous. That same year, he released his debut album, God Bless Tiny Tim. It came out under Reprise Records and was produced by Richard Perry. The album blended pop standards with early 20th century songs, creating something both nostalgic and fresh. The biggest hit was Tiptoe Through the Tulips. It climbed into the top 20 on the Billboard Hot 100. The album itself reached number 7 on the Billboard Top LPS chart and stayed there for 32 weeks. Over 200,000 copies were sold. Critics didn't know what to make of it. Some dismissed it as a novelty, but others recognized its brilliance. Tiny Tim didn't just sing in falsetto. He had range. His voice moved from a deep baritone to a delicate whisper. Songs like The Coming Home Party and I Got You Babe showed his versatility. Some critics even compared the album to Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Tiny Tim wasn't just breaking musical rules. He was breaking expectations. His act blurred the lines between comedy, nostalgia, and genuine artistry. His fame skyrocketed. On April 4, 1968, he made his first appearance on The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson. He performed Tiptoe Through the Tulips, leaving Carson amused and slightly baffled. But something about Tiny Tim fascinated him. Over the years, Tiny Tim became one of Carson's favorite guests, appearing on the show more than 20 times. Tiny Tim's engagement to 17-year-old Victoria May Boyner, better known as Miss Vicky, was one of the most unexpected moments in television history. It happened live on The Tonight Show, starring Johnny Carson, in September 1969. Tiny Tim, already famous for his oddball persona and falsetto singing voice, was 37 years old at the time. His announcement shocked the audience. The age difference was striking, but so was the way their relationship had begun. They had met only 3 months earlier at Wanamaker's department store in Philadelphia. Miss Vicky had approached him for an autograph. Tiny Tim, always drawn to old-fashioned romance, was smitten right away. That summer, he asked her parents for permission to marry. The engagement wasn't just a personal milestone. It was also a brilliant publicity move. Tiny Tim had become a frequent guest on The Tonight Show because of his quirky charm. Carson, who had a sharp sense of showmanship, played along with the moment. He jokingly suggested that they should get married on the show itself. The idea quickly became reality. Tiny Tim, always eager to entertain, embraced it. The wedding would be televised live in front of millions. By the time the ceremony took place on December 17, 1969, the event had become a national sensation. That night, 45 million people tuned in to watch. It was the second most-watched television broadcast of the decade, just behind the moon landing. The set was decorated with 10,000 tulips flown in from Holland, a tribute to Tiny Tim's famous song Tiptoe Through the Tulips. Reverend William Glenn Eskridge officiated the wedding. The vows included promises they had written themselves, one of which stated they would not be puffed up. Instead of champagne, they toasted with milk and honey. Tiny Tim did not drink alcohol, so he made sure the celebration reflected his lifestyle. The sheer scale of the wedding was unlike anything before it. To put it in perspective, Kim Kardashian's wedding to Kris Humphrey's wedding in 2011 only attracted 4 million viewers, while even the royal wedding of Prince William and Kate Middleton brought in just 23 million American viewers. Tiny Tim's wedding was on another level. It wasn't just a ceremony. It was a television spectacle. NBC had paid for the entire event, knowing it would be a ratings powerhouse. But behind the scenes, there were problems. Tiny Tim's eccentric behavior made the planning process difficult. He was obsessed with the smallest details. Producers worried about how unpredictable he might be during the live broadcast. But when the cameras rolled, everything went smoothly. The episode ended up with an astonishing 85% Nielsen rating. That meant 85% of televisions in use at that time were tuned into The Tonight Show. The gamble had paid off. For the audience, it seemed like a fairy tale, but those close to the couple saw the cracks forming before the wedding even happened. There were rumors of arguments and infidelity. Tiny Tim's diary entries reveal that he had doubts about his own feelings. He wasn't sure if he truly loved Miss Vicky or if he had been caught up in the excitement. The wedding had given his career a massive boost, but it also placed enormous pressure on his personal life. After the ceremony, they made a few more television appearances together. They even returned to The Tonight Show for a post-wedding interview. On camera, they appeared happy. In reality, their relationship was unraveling. Right after the ceremony, as they sat together in the limousine, Tiny Tim turned to his new wife and made a shocking request. He wanted an open marriage. Miss Vicky was stunned. She had just married a man who spoke openly about his deep Christian beliefs, a man who had claimed to save himself for marriage. Now, only hours after their vows, he was asking for the freedom to see other women. This wasn't a sudden change. Even while engaged to Miss Vicky, Tiny Tim had struggled with commitment. At one point, he nearly left her for another woman named Miss Iris. He later admitted that he only stayed because he couldn't bear to break Miss Vicky's heart. He had a strange way of seeing love. He placed women on a pedestal, treating them as something almost sacred. At the same time, he found himself drawn to the idea of chasing new romances. For Miss Vicky, the marriage fell apart almost immediately. They stayed legally married for 8 years, but in reality, their relationship ended within 2. She wanted a home and a stable family life. Tiny Tim wanted to focus on his career and his eccentric routines. Their daughter, Tulip Victoria, was raised mostly by Miss Vicky, while Tiny Tim drifted further into his own world. That world was built around habits most people found bizarre. Tiny Tim had an extreme obsession with cleanliness. He took up to 6 showers a day and brushed his teeth 4 times, using a mix of toothpaste brands like Crest, McLean's, and Gleam. He never used regular towels, only disposable paper towels. Public restrooms disgusted him. If he needed to use one while at a recording session, he would rather walk miles back to his parents' house than step inside. His eating habits were just as strange. He avoided eating in front of others and preferred to dine alone. Following strict routines, once he ordered an entire hotel menu, not to eat but to arrange the food in a decorative display. He believed in eating only raw vegetables and honey, avoiding cooked or processed foods whenever possible. These choices were not just about health. To Tiny Tim, they were part of a larger belief in purity, both physical and spiritual. Even his view on relationships followed an unusual pattern. He married 3 times, first to Miss Vicky in 1969, then to Jan Alice in 1984, and finally to Susan Marie Gardner in 1995. But in each marriage, he avoided living with his wives for long. With Miss Vicky, the separation happened early. She wanted a stable life, while he preferred to tour and keep his own space. His second wife, Jan, faced the same reality. They separated just 6 months after their wedding, but remained legally married for over a decade. His third wife, Susan, later revealed that even when they were married, they lived in different places despite being in the same city. Tiny Tim admitted that he struggled with relationships. He liked the idea of romance, but once the excitement faded, he lost interest. He insisted on sleeping in freezing cold rooms with no heat or air conditioning, something most people couldn't tolerate. He saw love as something magical, but he also kept his distance from it. Apart from that, Tiny Tim wanted to prove he was more than just a gimmick. He had a deep love for early 20th century songs and saw himself as a serious musician, but the industry didn't see him that way. His record label pushed out 2 more albums after his debut. Tiny Tim's second album leaned into a more serious tone, hoping to show his range, but audiences wanted the same exaggerated performance they had come to expect. His third album, For All My Little Friends, was a collection of children's songs. It received a Grammy nomination, but that didn't help sales. By 1970, his record label had given up on him, and his contract was gone. Without the backing of a major label, things only got worse. The same media that once celebrated his uniqueness now turned him into a joke. Satirical magazines like Sick exaggerated his quirks in cruel ways. People who had once cheered for him were now laughing at him. Tiny Tim knew it too. Even at his peak, he had admitted that people mocked him on the streets. Now, with his career in decline, the laughter was louder than ever. But he refused to disappear. Tiny Tim kept performing anywhere he could. He took small gigs, played at obscure venues, and even traveled with a circus. His fame had faded, but his passion never did. No matter how the world saw him, he never stopped being himself. Then, in January 1979, Australian artist Martin Sharp had a bold idea. He wanted Tiny Tim to set a world record for the longest non-stop professional singing marathon. Sharp had been fascinated with Tiny Tim for years. He painted his portrait over and over, produced his albums, and brought him to Australia several times. This event was the peak of their collaboration. The performance took place at Luna Park in Sydney. Tiny Tim sang for over 2 hours and 17 minutes without stopping. Sharp's camera crew filmed everything. By the end, the record was officially set. But what should have been a simple achievement became tangled in something much stranger. 5 months later, a fire tore through Luna Park, killing 7 people. Sharp became convinced there was a connection between the fire and Tiny Tim's performance. He also believed the fire was no accident. Determined to prove it was arson, he began working on Street of Dreams. The film was meant to be a biography of Tiny Tim and an investigation into the Luna Park fire, but Sharp never finished editing it. A rough cut was released at film festivals in 1988, and that unfinished version still circulates online. Even after this, Sharp and Tiny Tim continued working together. Sharp produced many of Tiny Tim's later albums, including Rock Chameleon and Keeping My Troubles to Myself. He also brought Tiny Tim back to Australia many times throughout the 1980s and 1990s. When Tiny Tim stepped onto the Tonight Show stage for the first time on April 4, 1968, he didn't look or sound like anyone else. With his long curly hair, ukulele in hand, and a voice that soared into a falsetto, he was impossible to ignore. Johnny Carson, always quick with a joke, leaned into the absurdity. He made light-hearted remarks, but it was never cruel. Beneath the laughter, there was real curiosity. Who was Tiny Tim? Where did he come from? Audiences felt the same way. They weren't just amused, they were fascinated. That night turned Tiny Tim into an overnight sensation. Over the next 20 months, he returned 13 times. Every visit was a mix of comedy, music, and pure unpredictability. But then, just as quickly as he had risen to fame, he started to fade. His appearances on The Tonight Show became less frequent. By the early 1970s, he was hardly seen on television at all. His final known performance on the show came in 1979. He sang Rod Stewart's Do You Think I'm Sexy? While wearing a jacket covered in comic book pages. It was as strange as ever. Then he was gone. No farewell, no public falling out, just silence. Tiny Tim was one of a kind. With his high-pitched voice and ukulele, he became a strange yet unforgettable figure in music. But behind the cheerful songs and playful performances, his health was falling apart. He had congestive heart failure and diabetes, 2 serious conditions that kept getting worse. Doctors told him again and again to stop performing. They warned that his body couldn't take the strain. But Tiny Tim couldn't imagine his life without music. No matter how weak he felt, he refused to leave the stage. On September 28, 1996, he arrived at a ukulele festival in Massachusetts. The crowd was small, only about 135 people, but they were excited to see him. As he stepped forward to introduce the band, something went wrong. His body gave out. He collapsed face first onto the stage. The audience gasped. Some shouted encouragement, hoping he would get back up. He didn't. Paramedics rushed him to the hospital, where he spent nearly 3 weeks recovering. His doctors gave him a clear warning. If he kept performing, he wouldn't survive. His heart was weak, his diabetes was out of control, and his diet wasn't helping either. If he wanted to live, he had to stop. But Tiny Tim wouldn't hear it. He had spent his whole life chasing music. He couldn't walk away now. Just 2 months later, he traveled to Minneapolis for a benefit gala at the Women's Club. Before the show, he told his wife, Susan, that he wasn't feeling well. She begged him to rest, but he refused. A performer had a job to do, and he wasn't about to let anyone down. By the time he took the stage, most of the audience had already left, but he performed anyway. He played songs and ended with his most famous hit, Tiptoe Through the Tulips. As he sang, his body gave out again. He collapsed in the middle of the song. His wife ran to him, trying to help him back to their table, but he was unconscious. He never woke up. Paramedics performed CPR and rushed him to the hospital, but there was nothing they could do. Tiny Tim was pronounced dead at 11:20 p.m. His death was tragic, but not surprising. He had pushed himself to the limit for years. Music was everything to him, and in the end, he gave his life for it. His voice, his performances, and his unwavering dedication left a lasting mark on the world. In 1968, Tiny Tim was at the height of his fame. That year, he performed at the Royal Albert Hall, a venue known for hosting some of the greatest musicians in the world. The entire show was recorded, but for some reason, Reprise Records never released it. The tape sat untouched for decades until 2000, when Rhino Handmade finally brought it to the public. The CD was a limited release, and it sold out quickly. Demand was so high that Rhino reissued it under their main label, giving more fans a chance to hear a performance that had been locked away for over 30 years. More lost recordings started to surface. In 2009, Collector's Choice released I've Never Seen a Straight Banana, Rare Moments Volume 1, an album featuring songs Tiny Tim recorded in 1976. These were some of his personal favorites, dating back as far as 1878. The album also included a few of his own compositions. It was produced by Richard Barone, who had worked closely with Tiny Tim. That same year, Justin Martell, a dedicated researcher of Tiny Tim's life, announced he was writing a biography. He spent years gathering details, speaking to those who knew Tiny Tim best, and collecting rare materials. In 2016, the book was finally published under the title Eternal Troubadour, The Improbable Life of Tiny Tim. Martell was already considered one of the leading experts on Tiny Tim. He had even contributed liner notes to I've Never Seen a Straight Banana and a later compilation album called Tiny Tim, Lost and Found 1963 to 1974 Rare and Unreleased, which was released in 2011. Interest in Tiny Tim kept growing. In 2013, a second biography was released. Tiny Tim Tiptoe Through a Lifetime was written by L.E.L. Tarling and illustrated by Martin Sharp. That same year, another rare recording came to light. Ship to Shore Phono followed up Lost and Found Volume 1 with a second volume. It included a 1974 live performance of Nobody Else Can Love Me Like My Old Tomato Can. Instead of a traditional release, they did something unique. They put it out as a limited edition wax cylinder, an old-fashioned format from the early days of recorded music. More hidden material followed. In 2016, Ship to Shore Phono released Tiny Tim's America, an album of demos recorded in 1974. These tracks had never been finished, but in 2015, producer Richard Barron and Tiny Tim's cousin Eddie Rinn added final touches to complete them. The album was called Rare Moments Volume 2 and was seen as a spiritual follow-up to I've Never Seen a Straight Banana. Even years after his passing, people were still fascinated by Tiny Tim. In 2020, Swedish journalist and filmmaker Johan von Sydow released Tiny Tim, King for a Day, a documentary that explored his unusual life and career. New recordings, lost performances, and books kept his story alive. Tiny Tim was never just a musician. He was an unforgettable figure who left behind a world of music waiting to be rediscovered. Tiny Tim's name is painted on the famous mural outside First Avenue, a legendary nightclub in Minneapolis. This honor is only given to artists who have sold out shows or made a lasting impact on the venue's history. It's not just a decoration. It's a tribute to musicians who shaped the culture of the city.